Hello there! Welcome to Skeleton Key Productions. I'm Crime Grace Gokon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're going to be answering the question of what if Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. Now within this alternative history we are going to be looking at three different scenarios, starting with three different dates. The first date is going to be March 1936 with the remilitarization of the Rhineland. The second one is going to be in March 1939 with the invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia. And the final one is going to be September 1939 with the invasion of Poland. Now within these three different scenarios we're going to talk about the merits of an Allied intervention, A, how likely it would have been that it would have resulted in a success, and B, talking about how that success would have actually affected the German people and German attitudes to it, because the only way to have a lasting peace is for the defeated side to fully be defeated and for it to be not even a debate. The problem with the First World War is that all of Germany's occupying forces were outside of their borders. They were in enemy territory, and so when their wartime economy actually collapsed and it was clear on the home front that they were unable to win that war, the so-called stab in the back myth was able to materialize, in which they said, oh, us soldiers on the front, we fought bravely and we basically won that war, and were it not for socialists in the background, or were it not for Jews or whatever the rest of the conspiracy theory was, we would have won. So Hitler was a main advocate for this theory, the stab in the back theory. Now the reason why such a myth did not materialize in the world post 1945 is because Germany was defeated. It was crushed unequivocally, undebatably. There was no stab in the back thing. The Germans did everything that they could, both the home front and on the front lines, and yet still they lost that war. And so Germans today understand and accept that they lost that war. So the point with all of these is that there is no point in defeating Germany if it's going to then stir up more trouble further along the lines. Because people often make the argument, oh, if it was me, I would have declared war in 1933. Well, that, first of all, it would have been a legal war by any international standard. You don't get to just invade a country just because some dude who got elected there you don't like, okay? At that moment in time, Hitler may have done some bad things domestically, but he's not done anything that would warrant foreign countries going in and invading and stuff, unless you're just in favour of regime change, which is a completely different story. There were clearly three moments in which Hitler violated international law, and so we're going to go through each of these in greater detail. So starting off with the first one, which is the remilitarization of the Rhineland. First of all, why was it needed to be remilitarized? Well, it was demilitarized as part of the Versailles Treaty, which said that Germany was not able to have a union with Austria. They were not able to have an air force, submarines, tanks, and their army had to be limited to a token force of about 100,000, which would barely be enough to defend itself against its neighbours. So to have 100,000 troops being able to defend all of those frontiers is, it wasn't serious, and the German people recognised it as such. Also, on top of that, they had to pay an exorbitant amount of war debts, and when the Germans couldn't pay those war debts in 1923, the French and the Belgians invaded the Ruhr Valley. The Ruhr Valley being the industrial heartland of Germany on the Rhineland. This was invaded, it was occupied, and it led to a great deal of bitterness. It explains the beer hall putsch, it explains many different things, the hyperinflation, everything, right? And this left a very nasty taste in the mouth of many Germans. If you had just gone in and invaded just at the wrong time, then this is something that very likely would have ended up happening. You would have had a repeat of the occupation of the Ruhr, because Germany would have felt like it had been done wrong by France once again. Now the Versailles Treaty was pushed forward predominantly by France. Britain and America wanted to be a bit more lenient towards Germany. They wanted to punish them a little bit, but they didn't want to be too harsh on them, because they wanted to maintain this balance of power within Europe. Particularly for Britain, our policy goal with regard to the continent has always been, for the past 500 years at least, to ensure that no one single country ends up dominating on the continent. By completely destroying Germany, as the Versailles Treaty did, the problem with that is that it left France completely without any competition on the continent. Add to this the fact that France also started to implement what was known as the cordon sanitaire. See, my French is getting a little bit better now, a little bit better than the earlier video. So the cordon sanitaire. This was basically the nations of Central and Eastern Europe, and the idea of this was that in the event of a war between France and Germany, France would employ its allies to the east of Germany, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, etc. All of these countries would gang up on Germany, and so Germany would be encircled by its enemies. Now, what's often not said with regard to the remilitarization of the Rhineland is this. Hitler's pretext for the remilitarization was this. France made a mutual agreement with the Soviet Union. So this meant that they made basically a military alliance with the Soviet Union. If Germany invaded the Soviet Union, as Hitler had clearly said in Mein Kampf was his intention, then France would go to war with them, and vice versa. However, France was making many of these kind of agreements, but it had no real will to actually stick to them. Within that agreement, it said that France would go to war with Germany if Germany invaded the USSR. However, there were so many caveats in it, and the main caveat was that they would only go to war with Germany if Britain and Italy also went to war with Germany. And as we know from our own timeline, Italy did not go to war with Germany. Italy joined Germany and fought the Allies. So we can see within this the inherent flaw of this. You're making military alliances with countries which you have no real will to actually back up. Now, we have to understand within this why France wanted to be so punitive against the Germans. Within World War One, they lost 1.4 million people, and a great deal of the French countryside was destroyed. Even today, they still are digging up shells and unexploded mines in the land which was once the Western Front. You can understand from a French perspective why they wouldn't want German troops west of the Rhine. However, it's quite unreasonable to demand a country to not put any of its troops into another region within itself. George Bernard Shaw made the very apt point that it would be the equivalent of saying to the British, hey, you know what, you can have an army, but you're not going to be able to march them to Portsmouth, okay? Or it would be like maybe the equivalent of saying no British troops in Kent. It'd be like, what? That's insane. Like, you don't have any right to say where our troops can go within our own borders. So remilitarization of the Rhineland was something which was very, very popular within Germany because they felt that they obviously had a clear right to be able to have troops within their own territory. And it was obviously one of the main things that Hitler wanted to get rid of within the Versailles Treaty, because that was just the most obvious kind of humiliation. And Germany had already been rebuilding itself. There'd been rearmament from March of 1935, in which their military spending went up, the level of troops went up. Now, to remilitarize the Rhineland, Germany only sent 3,000 troops. Now, this was in two parts. One, because if they sent a large army, it might be seen as an aggressive act, and it would provoke the French and British to actually go to war with them. Second of all, if they only sent a small amount and they were inevitably going to be kicked back, then he could say to the German people, look at this, even with this tiny force of 3,000 troops, the Allies have still been completely unreasonable when they kicked us out. So it was a win-win for Hitler, and that's why he kind of took the gamble. But even still, with these 3,000 troops, at any point within this campaign, if the French or the British had sent troops across the River Rhine and attacked Germany for remilitarizing the Rhineland, Hitler would have ordered those 3,000 troops to retreat. Now, historians have looked back at this and debated why the French didn't attack. Now, there is this kind of myth of the French being cheese-eating surrender monkeys, and, they might have a point, but what you have to understand is that France in 1936 was not in the best shape to start a world war. So first of all, France didn't have a government. It had a caretaker government. Second of all, obviously, the rest of the world, France was experiencing the fallout from the Great Depression. On top of that, many different countries around the world, in particular Britain and America, had come off the gold standard. So this meant that the rest of the currencies around the world, which had been pegged to this gold standard, all of a sudden had to devalue themselves. The French franc had to be devalued during this time, and there was a lot of disruption, a lot of like kind of unemployment being caused by all of this. And with an election coming up soon, the French people were like, well, actually, this talk of a war is actually going to push our economy over the place. So as much as possible, we don't want to really go to war with Germany. It's only been 18 years since the last one. Let's like just see how this thing goes. And on top of that, the British were not in favour of any kind of attack. Even Foreign Minister Anthony Eden, who would later become, well, at a later point he'd become Prime Minister, but he had been seen as a very kind of person who was in the staunch kind of anti-Hitler camp. But even still, he was even sceptical of sending troops in, because it would have been seen as basically a repeat of the Ruhr. It would have been seen as very, very unreasonable. British public opinion at the time did not want a war. People were very, very sceptical of it, and they saw no problem whatsoever with Germany sending its troops to another part of its own territory. And so if France had attacked, it probably would have been alone. It's very unlikely that the French would have had the stomach to have fought a full-scale war with Germany so soon after the last one without the backing of Britain. However, obviously we can look back with hindsight and say, damn, I wish you'd done that. I wish you'd gone, and I wish the French had gone to war. But even the Pope joined in on this. You know, it's really bad when even the Pope, you know, he's supposed to be the man of peace and love, and said that if 200,000 French troops had been sent in there, then they would have saved everyone else the trouble that came later. However, like I said, this probably was not the right time to have gone to war with Hitler. The German people were still very much in favour of Hitler, and it would have been seen as a very punitive, a very brutal kind of like a put down. I think a lot of people in Germany still would have supported Hitler and thought that what he had done was completely reasonable, and that any country, any self-respecting country, would have done the same. The next scenario is going to be March 1939. Now, people watching this who know the history may question why I haven't included Munich in this, and there's probably a strong argument that you could make for doing that. However, Britain and France were not in favour of going to war over Sudetenland. As Neville Chamberlain said, like, kind of, why would people in Britain want to go to war with Germany over a far distant land that like most people like didn't even know existed? So Munich was very much an agreement between Britain, France and Germany that they wouldn't go to war over the Sudetenland. The Sudetenland was predominantly German, and actually it was very, very not just pro-German but very, very pro-Nazi. Just to give a statistic on this, 17% of the Sudeten Germans were members of the Nazi Party. In Germany itself, that number was just 8%. So more than twice as many people in the Sudetenland identified with the Nazi Party than with Germany itself. This means that the 3 million Sudeten Germans who lived within the borders of Czechoslovakia, they were very, very much in favour of rejoining Germany, and the amount of fuss that they would have kicked up, eventually they would have risen up, they would have done something, yeah, like, so at some point Sudetenland was going to be absorbed by the Reich, whether by peaceful means or by violent means. Now, what was inexcusable and what really, really turned people around the world against Hitler was in March of 1939, so just a few months after Munich, where Hitler had said, I have no more territorial demands, I have no more ambitions, that's it. He did something which he hadn't even said that he'd do in Mein Kampf, and that was to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia. The argument for taking the Sudetenland was that, okay, right, it's self-determination. After World War One, every other country gets to self-determine. Poland goes to the Poles, like Czechoslovakia goes to the Czechs and the Slovaks. Why is Germany the only country that's not allowed to self-determine itself? Why are Germans not able to unite with the Austrians? Why are the Germans not able to unite with the Sudeten Germans? That was the kind of argument for it, along ethnic lines, along linguistic lines. It made some level of sense to say that actually every other country in Europe is able to self-determine. Why can't Germany? However, the invasion of the rest of Czechoslovakia completely flew in the face of this, right? And actually, I would say of these three scenarios, this is the one where like they should have invaded. It was a clear violation of Versailles. It was a clear violation of international law. There was no legitimacy for this. Taking a country of about 7 million Slavic people, when you're talking about we want to just reunite with like other German speaking places, that completely flies in the face of it. This was just naked aggression. This was naked occupation. And actually, the president of Czechoslovakia almost had a heart attack when Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, threatened to bomb Prague. You know, Hitler and his cronies brought Hatcher, President Hatcher. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. My Czech's not great. Brought President Hatcher to Germany and made him sign in the dead of night basically a surrender terms, which basically said, Czechoslovakia will be given up to Germany without a fight. It turned British public opinion against Hitler because he clearly couldn't be trusted. He clearly had broken his own promises. And also, it's March 1939. You have the whole of spring, you have the whole of summer. You would have had plenty of time to have actually planned things, to have put troops in order, and to actually start like launching campaigns against Germany, which, don't forget, they were remilitarizing. Their army was huge by 1939. It had grown to 3 million men from the 100,000 it had been before. And also in terms of spending, Germany between 1935 and 1937 ballooned its military budget by almost tenfold. Okay, so I'll have the stats on screen now of like all the different years for Germany and also all the different years for Britain, and just comparing those two in terms of military spending. I wasn't able to find figures for France, so those will have to do for now. But that gives you some kind of idea of just how huge the German rearmament program really was. But even still, Germany was not prepared to fight a war of that scale in the spring of 1939. And actually, if the British and French had been serious enough about it, they could have attacked. And actually, if there had been an attack, there was a plot within the German high ranks known as the Oster Conspiracy, in which the German military would have launched a coup against Hitler, overthrown him, and then restored peace and like law and order to the Reich. This almost happened in our timeline, and the only reason it didn't happen is because Britain and France didn't act, and therefore Germany paid no price for this naked act of aggression. They'd already left the League of Nations, and actually even in the remilitarization of the Rhineland, the only country within the League of Nations that voted against them was the Soviet Union. And the same thing again happened with this. Like no countries really did anything about it. Much as had happened in Manchuria with the Japanese in 1931, much as happened in Abyssinia when Italy invaded in 1935, the League of Nations did nothing. The Western Allies did nothing. They sat there and allowed a naked act of aggression by dictatorial powers. So I think that this would have been the perfect opportunity to have attacked Hitler, to have invaded Germany. This was the last time at which you could have attacked Germany, taken Hitler out, and taught the Germans enough of a lesson, like without A, them being embittered, and B, without it just being a very drawn out and long war. Anything that was done after this time just meant that it was going to be a long war. And as we know from our own timeline, this war lasted for 6 years. If it had been done properly in the early months of 1939, then we might have had a very different history. But you know what else is a different history? That like button. That like button should be history. That like button should have been smashed already. That like button should have turned blue. It should have been like you were Mike Tyson and you just beat the thing blue. So just beat it blue, hit it blue, whatever you want to lightly tap it. I don't really care. If you've already signed into YouTube, you might as well. Trying to hit 20 likes per video. So just do me a favor, do yourself a favor, do this channel a favor, hit the like button, because that will really help out the algorithm. More people watch this video, more people watch some of my other videos which have covered similar topics and are looking to go into a whole lot more depth into many other topics. So definitely, help a brother out. Just hit the like button, and back to the rest of the video. And now with the final scenario, we're going to be looking at the invasion of Poland in 1939. So the invasion of Poland happened because of the so-called Polish corridor around the city of Danzig, which is now Gdansk within Poland. Danzig had been a free city in which there was majority Germans. However, under the Treaty of Versailles, it allowed it to be a free port in which Germany and Poland could freely use it, because Poland needed access to the sea, and this was the only major port that they could really use. The problem with all this is that obviously the German majority in Danzig, they wanted to unify with Germany properly, and Hitler had demands by which German troops and German trains and everything could pass from Germany proper to its enclave in East Prussia, and the Polish corridor was blocking that. Poland obviously refused to do this, and so this was the pretext for Hitler to go to war with Poland in 1939. In August, you had the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the so-called Pact of Steel, in which Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union did a peace deal together. However, what was also included in that, which was kept secret at the time, was that the Soviet Union would also invade Poland from the east. Germany, from September the 1st, invaded Poland from the west, and then on the 17th of September, Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. And so Poland was completely crushed, and in this time, no one did anything. In these first 2 weeks in particular, when Poland had a fighting chance, Britain and France did nothing. And it was even said in the Nuremberg trials in 1946, which is the trial of all the high up surviving Nazis for war crimes. Field Marshal Jodl later said that if Germany had been attacked by France and Britain, they would have lost, because Britain and France on the Western Front in 1939 had 110 divisions. The Germans, in comparison, had 23. And these were very poorly trained, they didn't have many tanks because most of them were gone off to Poland. This is 23 largely low quality German divisions versus 110 British and French ones. So if they'd wanted to, they could have swept into most of Germany, and it would have taken the German army in Poland far too long to come back in order to defend Berlin, or at the very least like the centre of Germany. If this opportunity had been taken, yes, it could have been done. However, I'm very sceptical of these numbers. And yes, I know that there's other German generals such as Westphal who said that if Britain and France had invaded in those first 2 weeks, Germany wouldn't have been able to hold out past those 2 weeks. But I'm still very sceptical of that. I still think that those troops in Poland would have been able to swing back and started fighting there, and you may have ended up having a protracted war with a Western Front and an Eastern Front. And I still think that this would have been a very bloody war, which would have dragged on for much longer than people think. People always underestimate wars, and I don't see how this war would have been over very quickly. I don't think that Germany would have just collapsed in on itself in 1939. By September, I think that their military had grown even stronger than it was in March 1939, so they would have had even more time to prepare. They would have had even more armaments, which they stole from Czechoslovakia, which they obviously occupied, and they were in a much better position by September of 1939. But even still, that would have been better than waiting till May of 1940 before any action takes place on the Western Front, any serious action. Yes, I know there was a tiny campaign in the Saarland where France sent a few troops in and then pretty much retreated, and where the French ordered the RAF to not bomb German factories because they were scared of retaliation, where the Germans would bomb French factories. Yes, I know that all this happened. So because of all this, because of the unlikelihood of France and Britain actually going to war, because they didn't want war. They wanted to. They kept holding out in hope that at any moment Germany would see sense and stop this. But they underestimated Hitler. They underestimated the fervour of the Nazis. They underestimated how much the German people actually supported Hitler. I think we have to say all this with a caveat. I think even if we had gone to war in September 1939 and actually fought hard, I think even if we'd gone to war in March of 1939 and fought hard, I think that in both these scenarios, I think that the British public were and the French public were not prepared for war in the same way that the Germans were. Yes, it's all very well talking about hypothetically this many troops and that many troops, but I think ultimately it would have been a war which we were not prepared for, which the Germans were outspending us for, and which the Germans had far more spirit for. I think it's not beyond the realms of possibility that what happened in 1940, where the Germans basically destroyed France and like took over most of Europe, I think this still might have happened. As much as we want to have this myth that, oh, we could have taken out Hitler a little bit sooner if only we'd done this, only like there's an argument for that. At the same time, like when you're dealing with alternative history, you're dealing with knowns and unknowns. Obviously, a lot of things that we do know that there was this many troops, we do know that this, but you can't factor in morale, you can't factor in how willing people would have actually been once a fighting war had actually started to have actually put these things in practice. And something to bear in mind as well is that Churchill obviously gets revered for being like this kind of this war hawk, yeah, like kind of like the one person who saw what Hitler was doing and was like, we should go to war. And that's very true. Even in 1936, yeah, Churchill was saying no, like the remilitarization of the Rhineland, we need to go to war with him. However, we have to note that Churchill was the Secretary of State for War and Air in 1919, and he was the one that came up with this so-called 10-year rule. So this 10-year rule basically said that Britain does not foresee a major war being fought on the continent involved in it for the next 10 years. And so as a result, we can get away with like disarming. Now, there might have been some argument for disarming from the high point of like World War One down to a more reasonable level. At the same time, the level of disarmament meant that it took far too long to rearm. And so even in 1928, when Churchill was made Chancellor, he reinforced this law and said that unless there were specific things that actually met this criteria, that we should maintain this thing of disarmament. So even Churchill, before Hitler comes to power, he was like, no, we should disarm. This left Britain woefully unprepared for the very, very rapid rearmament of the Germans. And yeah, so I'm not trying to blame Churchill for this, but the thing is, we were all to blame for what ended up happening. As much as you can kind of say, oh, if this had happened differently, if that had happened differently, yeah, I think that the real problem comes with the Treaty of Versailles. And that's what we're going to discuss in the next video. What if the Treaty of Versailles had been less harsh? And we're going to look at all the things for that, because I think by the time you were leaving it till 1936, 1939, this reckoning had to happen. This total war in which Germany is finally actually destroyed had to happen. Like the fact that Versailles had built it up to this point and it hadn't yet reached its final conclusion, that's why it doesn't really make much sense when you say they should have done this, they should have done that, because everything, the ground was already laid for an embittered Germany which had not accepted it had been defeated, and until you had got to that point, World War II was inevitable, and Germany fighting hard in World War II to the very last man, to the bitter end, was guaranteed. Because of how humiliating Versailles was, and because of how this stab in the back myth had been allowed to propagate, that's why Germany fought so hard, because they didn't want a repeat of that humiliation. So yeah, so definitely stay tuned for the next video where we look at what if the Treaty of Versailles had been less harsh, what if Britain and America had had more say to balance out the French, and yeah, how the rest of the world would have reacted to that, and how history might have been slightly different. So that being said, have a great day and bye.